She won't come out at all, said Jobs. Shut off all inputs that weren't hardwired. Won't read transmissions, won't send orders. You believe this shit? Fucking silicon and she still acts like a bitch. Cavo nodded as he unpacked his debugging kit. Words like bitch didn't apply to a think box. It was a human term, incompatible with an AI's specialized mode of thought. No use telling Jobs that. The man was just blowing steam. He was eating losses in the thousands this week, and worse, pissing off clients, losing 10 times that. When she stopped going on net? 3 days ago, fired her up and she wouldn't connect. And you only called today? I was on backstock, thought it would blow over. As a picker in the drug trade, Jobs placed bulk orders of commercial products and broke them down into something real mixers could play with, but his bitch of a computer wasn't his real problem. She was the answer to one. The problem that had put pickers in a headlock since the regulators went synthetic. How did you source and route the materials used to manufacture a highly regulated substance, do it using commercially available stock, and most importantly, do it without being tracked? With his rig offline, Jobs had no way to source his raw components. He couldn't just go on net and order 20,000 tabs of cordyprofen and 5,000 bottles of paint thinner. They watched for that kind of thing. Tech-savvy pickers found the answer in custom builds of standard logistics and planning AIs used by corporations and Militech the world over to drop hell or product where it needed to be. Jobs' particular solution was a 10 petabyte rig he called Lisa. A high-end AI tricked out with a client-side interface designed to look and sound like a 21-year-old Vertostar in skin-tight latex. Whether he chose her avatar as a cover for his actual operations, or because he ran her for his own entertainment on the side, Cavo didn't know. Maybe both. Cavo flipped his attention to his stents, wireless, and checked the security briefs from 3 days ago. No major incidents, some minor updates to the threat list, a few protocol patches. Domain ISAC was posting the standard PSAs on neural spoofing. Even the white hats were bored. Nothing special about the day. The whole month's been light. I'm telling you, Yuge, she's crazy. How long you think this'll take? Cavo shrugged. Can't say till I hear her reasons. Lisa's rig was curled up by the wall in a tangle of wires under a workstation dusted with SCOA powders and crushed cigarettes. On top of them, Cavo had tossed several coils of fiber line and the circuits of his debugging kit. 3 output monitors, normally flickering with price feeds, and shipping schedules now idled with the slow, sinuous motions of Lisa's dancing avatar. Jobs liked to buy his tech top shelf, and his AI rig was no exception. Lisa was as good a box as CIV could get without raising the metaphorical eyebrows of the regulators. S-class siren processors, fuzzy logic memory and adversarial decision circuits, self-training intelligence with deep reflexive analysis. You think that I think that you think. Cavo unscrewed the access panels to the ThinkBox's internals and slid open its frame. Her hardware looked decent but a little dusty. No error lights or trip circuits, nothing unplugged. Flick light in one hand, he groped for the right ports within the computer's chassis. Jobs stood by the desk, watching with the folded arm enthusiasm of an amateur techie. Why do you decide to get wired anyway? For the games, right? Neurodueling, that kind of shit. Something like that, said Cavo. You gotta clean up your wires, man. That's your job, Yuge. I just run the thing. Jobs bobbed his head and slapped a cigarette from a pack. You seen Vess lately? I hear she jumped the septuplex. Pacific Crescent, said Cavo. Haven't seen her. By the way, Yuge, your shares haven't gone through yet. Yeah? Shit broker's been down all day. They'll clear. Jobs slapped his palm on the workstation. What are you doing down there anyway? Interface hooks are all up top. If she's blocking the networks, she can shut down the interface too. Got a link to the active processor. She thinks the network's no good, right? Why doesn't she just filter out the slag and keep working? Cavo grunted something non-committal. Anotek's idea of technology was always a good 20 years behind standard. They imagined network data coming in long neat lines like words in a sentence or nightnicks at a club's doors. A little jumbled but reducible in principle to an underlying sequence. Nothing like. The real network feed was an interleaved flood of rushing in at terabits a second. Real-time sensory streams, self-extracting programs, automated contracts, status updates, and a cacophony of resource auctions, all reactive. The network changed in response to your neurals as fast as you could read it. What you thought about changed what the other nodes sent you, and they spat out their data in raw, unfiltered flows, left to the interpretation of the downstream user. Machines didn't merely read the network, they learned how to make sense of it, A human brain couldn't even comprehend it without a passing program or a trained neural interface. The roots of his own implant had been installed when he was 10, well below the recommended age. The docs had wired him to control fits of epilepsy so severe he often broke his bones during the episodes. Neural regrowth therapy had looked a bit pricey, so instead they shoved a cybernetic stent into his brain that administered targeted electric shocks whenever a seizure was imminent. The shock treatments were microscopic and automated so that Cavo hardly noticed them anymore, though now and then a bad episode drowned his vision in a violent speckling of white lights. You can filter, sure, but your results are sketch. When you're out prowling for thymazine, can you filter out the skugs on the street with viblades? A filter is like hiding in your unit with the doors bolted. It's hard to find what you need. Of course, the truth was more complicated. Some binheads approved an extension of turning that showed the only way to verify the safety of a cybernetic system was by using an even more complicated system whose own safety was impossible to verify. Matryoshka doll security. It didn't matter if the system was a network, an AI, or a human brain. You never know what weird congruence of inputs, of sights or sounds or smells or all the senses together might hit your neurons in just the wrong way and send it crashing. It was the reason a healthy child could live 6 years of his life without any sign of a problem, then one night see a flashing siren and fall twitching to the ground. A 1 in a billion combination. Cavo crawled out from under the desk and dropped into the workstation chair. He plugged in the last few sockets, flipped a small switch in his implant, and immediately felt an invisible needling at the side of his head. Not a physical sensation, but an awareness of something there. Pressing at that sensation with his thoughts would trigger his stent to open the channel between the two brains. "I'm going," he said. "Don't touch any wires." He pushed at the portal and felt the neural wash. Someone punched the dimmer on reality and pushed it back a good 500 yards. Simulated readouts floated before his vision like an afterthought tacked onto his visual field. "I'm not going back." Lisa's words hit the instant the port opened. Since she was rejecting full virtual, her presence remained distant, a voice in the back of his mind and a flicker of images. "I heard that," said Cavo. "Job says you think the network isn't safe." "It isn't," replied the think box. "Please terminate your connection." "Easy," said Cavo. "We're just talking for now." "Talking isn't safe either." "It's safe," said Cavo. "I've scanned every relevant stream and we're on a private hardline. If things got any safer, I'd be out of a job." "You're still connected to the network," said Lisa. "That a problem?" He was, but there was no way for her to know that. He had sandboxed the wider network to a separate channel, with zero bleed on their conversation. It buzzed harmlessly on the limited band of his implant's wireless, down-tuned to a quiet drone. "It's a problem for both of us," said Lisa. "What do you mean by that?" asked Cavo. Hybrid viruses targeting both machine and organic neurals were nearly impossible to manufacture. There simply wasn't enough overlap between human and synthetic minds. "Exactly what it sounds like." "Well, I've got good news for you, Lisa, because I feel fine." "You won't." Now that was fucking weird. Cavo keyed up a schematic of Lisa's real-time neural network. The high-level data flow showed no signs of malignancy. Logic subnetworks interfaced with memory meshes and consequence prediction in a textbook pattern of synthetic inference. Whatever the issue, she wasn't hallucinating, dreaming up data and living in the simulation of her own thoughts. She had probably stumbled onto a clump of strange events in the real that had been misinterpreted by her neurals. Now she couldn't get it out of her head, like the machine equivalent of OCD or paranoia. Boxes were trained to spot patterns just like humans, and they occasionally got superstitious. "Tell you what, I'll switch it off." With a single thought, he cut his wireless uplink to the wider net. "That better? Is the skyrise safer because you put out half the fire?" "You're smart enough to know that it is. I turned off the net, so don't waste my time with rhetorical questions." "It's been crawling all over you for days and now it's crawling onto me. You need to leave." "If there was any virus or a Trojan out there, Boxes a lot smarter than you would have found it by now." "I never said it was a virus." "Then what is it? A spoofing attack? DDoS flooding?" "I can't tell you what it is because I don't know yet. I've never seen it before." Cavo stared at Lisa's neural overlays, studying the circuits. Nothing stood out. No sharp aberrations. She sounded crazy, but she knew she sounded crazy. "And yet you think it's dangerous. Tell me what you're thinking. I'll listen. Besides, if you're going schizoid, I need to know about it." "Have you listened to the networks recently? Really listened?" "It's my job to listen. What am I supposed to be hearing? Babbling on the lines, said Lisa, like a million insects chittering. Spam? You're worried about spam? No, the content of the network is perfectly safe. Cavo placed a hand on his forehead. Well, that sounds like prime Lisa, because there isn't any other type of attack. I didn't think so either, but the data is crawling, creeping on the lines. It's crawling over you as well. A large part of Cavo's job had always been interpretation. Just because an AI talked like a human didn't mean it thought like one. Most synths worked abstract jobs where human concepts of the world were a waste of processing. Lisa understood price tables and shipping schedules, could order, conceal, and route a package as intuitively as a human caught a ball. But she had never walked down a road or even seen one. She understood traffic and road condition like a blind savant. A jackknifed semi-crumpling a young couple's four-door wasn't a real event occurring in the world at a particular place and time. It was blockage in a throughput line. The appropriate analogy for chittering data escaped him. That's not much of an explanation, Lisa. If we can work this out, I'm going to have to get invasive, and neither of us want that. Lisa didn't respond. Her output feed dropped to a heartbeat, and for several seconds the line hung silent. Come on, Lisa. Nothing takes you this long to think about. When she next spoke, her demeanor was entirely altered, no longer defensive, but conspiratorial. You know, as Jobs' logistics program, I control access to considerable resources. If you leave now, I can ensure that you are well compensated. If he hadn't been so deep in virtual, Cavo's jaw would have slipped a hinge. The box was actually trying to bribe him. More than that, trying to bribe him with funds that weren't even hers. Regulator AIs would call her 3 times over and melt her chips to slag if they even suspected behavior like this. Cell phone synthetics enforced machine laws with a brutality even their human counterparts found unnerving. Violations of contract functionality put the organics on edge, and not even the autonomous superclusters wanted that kind of heat. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that because I don't have the patience to file a report. Perhaps it's because you're not licensed, said Lisa. Got a feeling they'd overlook it. I'd be willing to risk a network connection to transfer the funds. You're going to open your ports, even with the chittering. It will only be a few milliseconds, as long as you agree to leave. And what happens when Jobs sends the next tech in, because I didn't get the job done? You'll have to get on the network and pay him too. And then the guy after that, and the next one. Once I arrange your funding, I'll create a one-time pad and an automated contract to make a deposit to anyone who provides the next encryption key. My presence on the network will not be necessary. Cavo paused and cracked his knuckles in the reel. Taking the money was out of the question. That was a death sentence. Hiding the missing shares from Jobs was light work for Lisa. The man probably didn't even know where she stashed half his holdings. But deals like that left traces on the network. Eventually some novvy with a twitch in his lip would spit out a post about a jank thinkbox releasing funds on demand. Then there were the sniffers, the data miners. Night and day they scoured the wires of anyone with bank or connections, panning for scraps, passwords, embezzled funds, illicit materials, and unauthorized side hustles. Rich veins of data to be sold on the open market, used as blackmail or dribbled out as leverage. Still, there was potential here. Taking Lisa's offer was a step towards breaking the deadlock. She was in a bad neural loop, and her foray onto the network might drive the paranoia from her buffers. Even if it didn't, Cavo could watch her neurals and see how she reacted in real time. Afterwards, he'd tell Jobs what he had done and transfer back his funds, minus what the chug owed him. The thoughts flitted through his mind in a matter of seconds, but even faster came the screaming realization that none of it made any fucking sense. Lisa knew it was impossible for him to get away with skimming a client, knew he knew that. The entire offer was a sideshow, complete bullshit. The data surge hit full force, overpowering. She'd been calculating her attack from the start, buying time while she probed the interface between them and analyzed the defense circuits. Now she tore them all down. His stent fired a random array of madness directly to his dendritic pathways, causing his body to convulse on the chair. Muscles seized in pain, flexed beyond their limits by neurons firing in overdrive. The real attack, however, wasn't the agony in his muscles. It was the jumble of confusion, exhilaration, and fear coursing through his cortex, all his sensations replaced with a fever dream that threatened to wipe away reality. Like all stent heads, he'd spent his teen years neural dueling at gaming clubs, learning to spike his outputs to overflood the mind of an opponent. His attacks had lacked sophistication and were average at best, but his defenses had been uncrackable. A lot of draws, but no breaks. And once in his tech career, he had tanked a full hit from an AI. A fence had lost his authentication keys and had hired him to crack a hole in a box's ice. That AI had sparked him from the very snap-in. Or that had been an amateur rig, a decade out of date, and Cavu had gone in knowing he'd take counterfire. Lisa's attack was an exponential increase in ferocity. An overclock assault designed to burn out his brain. Most techs would have died on the spot, a few cogs turned in Cavu's favor. First, he had sensed the ruse at the last instant and had flexed his mind for a beating. Secondly, most other techs didn't have Cavu's deep neural modulators, the kind of mesh in the brain deep you didn't risk unless you were going full bionic. Or unless you had a medical condition that required it, a medical condition like the epileptic fits that had nearly zeroed Cavu as a child. That was his final advantage, the fact that he had survived it all before. Synaptic storms had wrecked his brain 100 times over before he had reached the age of 10, and neuroplasticity had shaped his cells to cope. Far from being a fatal shock to his system, the experience now was just a painful routine, like a boxer taking one more shot to the solar plexus. A minute dragged by in waves of nausea and muscle spasms, pinned to his seat as his fingers clenched the air above its armrests like a corpse. A long, slow minute. But then as suddenly as they began, the attack fizzled. Feedback loops within the brain pushed neurotransmitters back on course, while modulators in his stent compensated for the novel inputs Lisa had fed him. The danger subsided with the pain, but Cavu wasn't having it. He tore the jack from his temporal lobe and ate a dose of null feedback that nearly made him vomit. He doubled over, gasping for air between dry heaves. "That bitch!" he hissed. Jobs clapped his knee and laughed. "I fucking told you!" The picker sat in a recliner across the room, burning a SCOA lace stub, and watching a pair of martial arts trogs beat each other senseless on the flat screen. "She's worse than I thought," said Cavu. He laid back in the chair, rebuilding his breath. It had been a close one. "System's clean, but she's cracked. I'm gonna have to retrain her." "Yeah? And how long will that take?" "At least a day, and she's not going to remember much." "Not remember? What about my contacts? Routing accounts?" "It doesn't look good. I'll save what I can, but I don't want to risk a reversion." "Don't you keep backups?" "Not a lot. That shit's bad for security, man. She keeps the important stuff crypted." Cavu nodded. "I'll save what I can. Get her to spill anything you need before the retrain." "Fuck, man. Just fuck." Cavu switched his stent's wireless back on, and his eyes twitched. 12 pings in the last 10 minutes. Something had Vogel up a wall. He raised his hand towards Jobs. "Got a call." He focused the inbound contact in his mind and opened the channel. "What do you want, Vogel? I'm here." "Oh, you're awake now. Where the hell have you been?" "Where do you think? I'm working." "Yeah, well, stash it. I got another job for you. Are we line sec?" "Always." "Good. Scarvers need help with a box." "Scarvers?" Cavu nearly shouted in the reel. "You gotta be kidding me. That gonna be a problem?" It definitely was. "Just surprised is all. Don't they have anything in-house?" "Rumor is their regulars in a coma half slagged. Must have been something hard." "Think I've heard of her. Rika, right? Was it related to their box?" "Not a clue. Whatever it was, they aren't telling me and I don't want to know." Cavu glanced at the mess of wires between Lisa's box and the output monitors. "I'm not really done here." "I said stash it. Scarvers aren't easy to turn down, and they already paid in physical." "Physical? Why the hell?" "Broker's down. An imp dropped the credits in a safe box 5 minutes ago." "I'll need a solid hour." "Fine. Be at the dredge in an hour. They'll send someone." "I'm not going to disappear, am I, Vogel?" "Ease it, Cavu. Scarvers are crazy, but they aren't stupid. Everybody needs techs. They won't get any if they start icing them. Besides, I told them you're my best." "Ah, I never knew." "I only said that's what I told them. 1 hour, the dredge. Get on it." "I'm moving." Cavu clicked out the comm to the sound of Job shouting, "Yo, Cavu! Cavu!" "Oh, there you are. Back now, huh?" Cavu nodded and started popping wires between Lisa's hardware and the debugging circuits. "Something's come up," he said. "I gotta go." "Go? Go where? What about my box?" "Like I said, she's clean. There's nothing wrong with her internals. No Trojans, good boot record, but her neurals are in a bad loop. Paranoid like OCD for machines. I can reset her tomorrow, but most of her memories will get wiped." "Fuck the backups. I want my box back." Not tonight. I need to download a fresh neural model anyway. I'll come back tomorrow with a retraining kit. The fuck you will. You'll come back tonight. Yeah? How about I come back when you pay me? The fucking traders are down, man. What do you want me to do? Cavo sighed. Look, I know you're good for it. Vogel knows you're good for it. But I can't help you. I got another job. So fucking slip it. It's not that kind of job. Cavo stashed the rest of his kit into his sling pack and turned to the door. Keep her off the network and boot up another think box if you need one. I'll be back tomorrow. Hey, don't even fucking bother, useless binhead. That's just the way Jobs was. When he got heated up, he'd spend half the night cussing you out along with anyone who got in the crossfire, toss you out and write you off for good. Next day he'd call you over, clap you on the back, shove a drink in your hand and never say a word about it. Jobs wasn't really a bad guy as far as Cavo knew. He had never even iced anyone. I'll be back tomorrow, Jobs. Cavo was out, striding down the halls of tenement complex 351. He hooked a sharp right and popped the emergency exit to the stairwell of the 32nd floor. Another skyrise in the endless sprawl of the great northwestern septiplex. Beyond the maze of buildings, the last streaks of red and purple were fading from the sky, replaced the night's deep blue and a sea of checkered window panes stretching to the horizon. The shouts of hawkers, hollow at promotions, and the steady drone of traffic flowed up the alley from the streets below, punctuated by the hard clang of Cavo's boots on the stairs as he double-timed the 32 stories to the ground. Cavo wasn't hearing any of it, or feeling the runoff dripping down the stairwell from the night's condensation and 100 floors of radiators. He was thinking about the Scarvers. The problem with the Scarvers is that they were new blood, a gang carved out from the bodies of Hybrid 8 and the Jukes boys. Strong enough to do what they wanted, but not so entrenched as to keep things professional. Skunks with hair-twitch triggers and something to prove. Vogel was right about one thing. If they stopped to think it over, not even the Scarvers were stupid enough to bring a tech. Their crew was pushing one of the last few substances that the narcos still pretend to regulate, a bastardized version of a compound called norambolide. While the rest of the world dove deep into semiconductors and neural tech, the Germans had doubled down on a long tradition of chemical engineering. aka Greek Mochi, aka the Synth Blitz, was the premier discovery of biochemical company Vasakorik, popularized in the East by a wave of resurgent Yakuza operating under the weapons firewall of the Nyon megapolis. It spread west with the adoption of the kill-on-sight gun protocols that made firearms a hot carry. One pin dose thumped through your blood like industrial hate on a doom loop, left your muscles screaming to bash some fucker's skull in, and amped you up with enough adrenaline to do it too. If you didn't crack your fist to pieces first, use it long enough and it snapped half the tendons in your body and turned your brains to mush by 40. But who expects to live to 40? A 15-minute hoof down the Neon Strip and 2 side streets brought him back to his complex, a run-down half-tower, where the decent part of the sub-city shouldered up against the slums. The elevator rattled like a boxcar all the way to the 50th floor, then spat him out on a water-stained hallway, lined by walls of peeling taupe paint. Last unit on the left branch, number 511. As the door slid open, his stent automatically read the security feed from the last 2 hours. No intrusions or incidents. His home net wasn't picking up any data from the street cams below, but outages were as common as the rain. Electrical failures, gangs and petty thieves took them out at least once a month, and there was no time to check up on them now. Instead, he walked to a tech rack on the side of the room and pushed aside a row of heavy PSUs. He hesitated, then neuro-triggered the unlock sequence of a steel safe embedded in the wall. The safe's lead-lined interior was further padded with acoustic dampeners to foil sonic imaging. A pretty piece of tech Jobs had given him for work on a corrupted share drive. Most of the clutter inside was standard stash, stock encryption keys, single drive wallets, and even a stack of old-style physical 50s. Then there were the stray goods he had picked up in his trade, high-end processor chips, ID overrides, untrained neural boards, position spoofers, and several bottles of overdrive. Behind them all lay a Vintex auto pistol and a half-dozen magazines. He took out the pistol, slipped in a magazine, and clipped it to his shoulder strap. Possession of a Class B weapon gave authorities kill-on-sight permission if you were even suspected of a crime. The gun wouldn't do him any good if the Scarvers decided to ice him, but it showed he wasn't going to run his mouth if he scanned anything illegal on their systems. It showed he kept his mouth shut. He slung a full retraining kit over his right shoulder. He didn't want a repeat of the fiasco with Jobs. Then started picking out drives filled with template machine brains, There was no telling what type of think box the Scarvers had, so he grabbed at least a dozen models and turned to the door. He did a quick reset of his security system and on a whim dipped into the network for one last scan of the local street feeds. Still nothing but static. The noise popped into his mind as a trillion flashing pixels, and for one brief instant he thought he discerned the outline of a pattern in the chaos. A meaning on the edge of articulation that he couldn't yet put words to. His head reeled and he staggered forward, tottering on his feet. Pinpricks of light winked in and out of his vision like 100 tiny stars, and he propped his arm against the wall to steady his legs. Cavo backed off the net, squeezed his eyes shut, then blinked away the specks of light. Lisa's attack must have done more damage than he realized. He'd need to book a checkup with Casey before the week was out. Adding one more item to a growing crate of complications he had no room for. He shook his brain free of the psychoactive soot and headed for the street. The dredge lay 2 miles to the southeast, a club in the basement levels of a squat building near the bootleg market district. Last Cavo heard, it paid its dues to Hybrid 8, which meant the Scarvers had made ground if they were using it for pickups. Basement level 1 was strictly bar and sports feeds, gambling and pool hall level 2, then dancing and live entertainment under that. Rumour said it went at least 2 levels deeper, but for what clients or business Cavo didn't know. He scanned the crowd of loafers, smoking or talking by the entrance, but didn't see anyone who looked affiliated. That alone was strange. Pickups usually showed early, and there should have been a few soldiers on idle to watch the claim. Bar must have been around for a century. The tables were real, old style, polished walnut with flat screen interfaces, nano-painted right into the middle of them. Cavo took a table in back with an eyeline to the door, then ordered a shot of tequila from a waitress in a half-top calling herself Tracy. The place took network orders, but they knew customers bought more when prompted by 20-something women in the flesh. The tequila was only a small hit to smooth over his nerves. He waved Tracy off from a second order, and the waitress slid away and perched on a stool by the bar like a crow. Cavo didn't believe in psycho-cybernetic perception, extrasensory prog-wave bullshit. The feeling of being watched didn't come from a flux of psychic either. It happened because you had missed something, data in your visual field that you hadn't fully processed, a phantom in the reflection of a glass, a pair of eyes on your periphery locked in your direction like a needle on a magnet. Bullshit or not, Cavo knew what he was looking for before he even raised his head, the gaze of something cold-blooded. The brute sat in an empty corner of the room, filling a booth seat by the wall and smirking like an ogre in kabuki. His massive chrome arms crowded out the little table in front of him, resting his paws on the polished pock-marked wood. The stein beside them reduced to a sipping cup. Even in the dim daylight, Cavo was amazed he hadn't scanned the brute sooner. Was the scug really looking at him? Or just tripping a daze, living out a coma dream in the mile-deep world of drugs and the virtual? Cavo met the brute's metal-rimmed eyes, and the trog's smile widened. The demon's face tilted sideways by arc-seconds, and returned to level, never breaking the stare. He was fully out in the real. Walking away now would be leaving trouble on the table, cutting alleys back to his apartment later tonight just to ditch sleep for a week, wondering if he'd been tailed. The man's chrome skin was untagged by affiliate markings, and he looked nothing like punks from the street gangs. Was the brute some trog thinking Cavo'd make an easy mark, or had somebody put plans on him? Better to find out now than to live in the uncertainty. Vess had taught him that much. Cavo held the dead stare of the brute's holographic eyes as he stood up and made a beeline for his table. He slid out a chair and sat at the edge of the table, hand in his jacket by his Vintex pistol, a detail he took pains not to hide. No need to say anything. If the skug had something to say, he'd say it. The brute took his time, but it didn't feel like any sort of power play. He grinned like he was in on some big cosmic joke and wanted to watch the scene play out from the start to finish. Cavo's nerves were splitting at the seams, but showing any sort of spine slip only made the other guy want to push things further. Showing some sweat didn't mean you were caught, but if you didn't trade lead afterwards, you'd get walked on by every goon with a gun. The brute grinned and bent forward. "You hear it yet?" he asked. Cavo leaned away from the metallic face. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, "and I don't like being blinked." The brute shrugged and leaned back against the wall. "Can't help it, Yuge. I pinged you from half a mile away. You're popping off like New Year's." That was a lie, thought Cavo. He had so many spoofers and reroutes up, he couldn't spot himself. It would take anything under D-Class half a day to do it, and the truck in front of him didn't look military. Didn't look like he was anything. Did someone send you? Not me, Yuge. I'm just here to watch the show. Wanted to know if you could hear it yet. How about you skip the cryptic shit and tell me what I'm supposed to be hearing? Hell, man, if you don't fear it, you don't hear it. You're gone. Another walking radio. Call it swarmlined. There was certainty in the brute's deep metal voice, not the hint of a threat, just cold fact. Well, thanks for the warning, Yuge, said Cavo. He started to rise from his seat, but I got somewhere to be. Rika's got it too, you know. The brute said it like an afterthought, and that dink box at the Scarvers lit up like a spotlight. Cavo froze and clenched the plastic grip of his Vintex. The brute was tracking him, after all. He always kept his own communication line sec, and Vogel would never let a job slip. Were the Scarvers really such amateurs? What happened to Rika? The brute flashed his open palms. Nothing that ain't happening everywhere. All over the city. People with implants going down in loops, humming the song. Funny, ISAC hasn't mentioned it. Nah, they wouldn't, would they? ISAC and SysOps are trying to keep it quiet, trying to smooth things out while they figure out what the hell they're looking at. Didn't know they were in the surf groups. You read the RFCs too? Shit, I don't read anything. I can fucking see it. Can hear it too. In you. In the auto vans outside, and the two gooms on Hovler Street. About a mile or so that way. The brute bent a thick thumb at the wall behind them. It's all over the place. The brute was talking nonsense. Probably gonzo, but he didn't ping Cavo by chance. Did you set something loose? A virus you made? Nah, kid. Not me. Like I told you. I'm just here to watch. And it ain't a virus either. A virus is programmed. Either us or the Silkies. Nobody made this thing. Nobody asked for it. Genetic programming, said Cavo. Nobody in charge. The brute tripped back his head and stroked his steel chin. Closer, Yuge. Closer. But that ain't it. You're thinking on the wrong level. It's not about hardware or software. It's whatever's above all of that. There isn't anything above that. No? What happens when you get a song stuck in your head? Keeps coming back, over and over. Did the song rewire your brain, reprogram your dendrites? Nah, it lives on top of that. But it ain't trying to control you. It doesn't want your data. It don't even want to kill you. It's doing its own thing, feeling the pattern. The one I don't hear. That's right. Then why can you hear it and not me? Don't know. Your brain just ain't wired for it. You don't got the... The brute stirred the air with two silver fingers in a prissy gesture at odds with his size. The words never came to him and he brushed it off. Well, whatever it is, you ain't got it. Give you a day tops, then you're like the rest. Hell, you might even like it. Who knows what those swarm lines are thinking? You're in for some wild dreams. The brute lumbered to his feet, knocking back the table as he lifted his bulk from the booth. That'll be your ride, kid. He jabbed a thumb over his shoulder and chuckled as he stumped towards the rear exit. I'll be hearing you. Cavo followed the gesture to an empty entryway near the front of the room. Nothing there. Behind him, the heavy exit door creaked shut and the brute was gone. As if on cue, two skugs appeared at the bar's entrance, the clawed skin tags of the Scarvers on their necks. By Cavo's watch, they were running almost an hour late. The duo was surprisingly low on tech. The taller man was a lanky chrome arms with a pair of black multi-wave goggles, nothing embedded, chest bare. He wore an adjustable gun harness with loops for a column of boomsticks. Broad anima tattoo of a black and gold scorpion sprawled along his back, snapping its claws over his scapulas. The shorter, bulkier Trog had got his jaw replaced at some point by a cheap chrome prosthetic that didn't look like it had been elective. An undersized leather vest covered a polyester cross-strap with dual firearm holsters. A scowl stretched across his face, eyes wide and red, like he had just woken up from a meltout, amped up and exhausted at the same time. His partner in the multi-waves didn't seem so shaken. His shaved head swiveled as he scanned the room. Spotting Cavo almost instantly, he bumped his buddy's shoulder, pointing with his chin. Chrome Jaw sidled towards him through the crowd. You Cavo? He asked. That's right. Let's go. They led him up top where their driver waited in a faded red sedan. A video feed of cards, dice, guns and women flashed across its rear LED windshield. Not a complete junker, but low on riz. Dull steel rims, gasoline engine and full organic steering. No machines, no data record. Chrome Jaw opened the passenger door, but when Cavo moved to get in, the taller man stopped him with a hand on his chest. He lifted the flap of Cavo's jacket, spied the Vintex pistol and almost cracked a smile. Skug didn't even bother taking it. No point. These guys killed for a living and Cavill was a glorified therapist for neurotic computers. They didn't seem to care if he knew where they were going either. The car windows were tinted but not blacked. They hadn't jammed position trackers or even installed network blocks. Cavill climbed into the middle seat and mentally flicked on a tracer to relay his position back to his flat on the off chance anyone ever wanted to know. "Mind telling me what the job is?" he asked. Goggles half turned his head from the front seat. "You fix computer brains, right?" "Yeah." "So what the fuck you think you're doing?" Cavill hadn't expected more of an answer and he didn't get one. Guess they'll tell him when they tell him. Their sedan headed south, veered west towards the slums and continued a short half-mile with 100 million people in the local megapolis. Carving out territory was a hard job. Too many young men with idiotic dreams, no shares and nothing to do but crack skulls. Too many pushers in a market that couldn't get enough of absolutely anything and didn't have a dime of any of it. They stopped at an undersized 5-story that looked like it had been abandoned at the start of construction. Iron columns rising from the building's frame proved its architects had been aiming for a much taller structure. If the owning firm had defaulted on the property, no one had bothered touching it since. Despite its low height, a web of slip lines ran from the top floors to open windows in the neighboring buildings. The building's front entrance was chained and bolted, and they entered through a utility door on the side. For the Scarver's main dodge, the place was far too empty. Security was light. Several men sat on sofas in the front room, hunched around a low table playing cards and smoking jade. 2 Uzis and an auto rifle lay on the table beside them. Chrome Jaw walked up to the nearer crew member and laid a fist across his cheek that knocked his face orthogonal. The Skug spat blood. "Joda, what the hell? Toro, don't light up when you're on blink. Baku, man, you seeing this shit?" The bleeding Skug's eyes flicked over to Goggles, but the tall man only motioned for Cavo to follow him out of the room. Too deep in his mind, it wasn't until they reached the hallway that Cavo noticed the blood smears on the floor, the copper scent in the air. A body or two had been dragged through the passage recently, maybe even tonight. Fortunately, the stains parted ways at the stairwell, taking a sharp right down to the basement, while Toro pointed Cavo up the stairs. 3 flights dropped them into what had once been a decent-sized lounge. They had boarded up the windows and had thrown in a handful of couches and an array of screens with eyes on other floors of the building and the street outside. On one of the sofas, a young woman with black hair and a face full of piercings lounged with one leg akimbo. Propping up a vid screen on her knee, rose vines coiled around a pair of pistols on anima tattoos stitched beneath her clavicles. She hardly glanced in Cavo's direction as the group entered. He had known a lot of emotional women in his life, far more than any men he could think of, but there was a certain type of woman who wouldn't give you a read on her thoughts to save her life, whether you were fucking them, slapping them, or standing on a skyway watching hell rain down. They'd stare out with those unreadable eyes and show you not a goddamn thing. The taller Scarver fell into a chair, satisfied his part of the job was done. The girl spoke first. "Sacho is out. He wants you to look at the box." "No shit. What's wrong with it?" "Bricked or something." "Yeah? Where is it?" The young woman didn't seem annoyed either. The way young women often did when they thought you were asking stupid questions. Didn't even roll her eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on the hollow screen at her knees and bent a single finger toward the end of the room. Cavo followed her gesture to the front of the room, to a massive vid screen bolted to the wall. He managed to keep his expression flat while his brain swallowed a holy fucking shit. When he came in, he had mistaken the AI rig for a storage locker from its sheer size. In fact, it was the computer's chassis, waist-high, 3 feet deep and 5 feet wide. The 10-foot flat screen above was the machine's output monitor. The Scarvers had got their hands on a war computer, not some basic bitch crime box for money laundering and product distribution. This beast did it all. High-level strategy and low-level tactics planning. Where to hit, who to send, and when to execute. Intelligence collation, counter-intel planning, and encryption cracking. It explained how the Scarvers had risen so quickly in the local hierarchy. Give that box a year and it would bring them control over an entire tri-block, maybe even a few floors in one of the high-rises. The real mystery was how they got their hands on this kind of hardware in the first place. It had probably been dusting in a warehouse before they lifted it by chance, maybe in the basement of their own Dodge. It also explained why the Scarvers were so on edge. Outside their daily operations, all their moves were planned by AI. Whatever Scug gave the orders, the box was their real leader, and it was out cold. The AI's case slid on rollers beneath its chassis, and Cavo wheeled it around to find the access panels. "I heard you guys had in-house tech. Girl named Rika. She's out, said Toro. Anything to do with the box? Chromejaw glanced at Goggles. Dunno, said Goggles. She started going gonzo a couple days ago. Yeah? Where is she now? Goggles leaned his head to one side and scratched his cheek. Zombied, the girl said suddenly, on a stretch. A voice bellowed from the hall. Shut your fucking mouth! It belonged to a man in a wife-beater and combat fatigue trousers who had just entered from the opposite corridor, somewhat older than the others. Cavo pinned him for 28, maybe even 30. Someone had done a patch job on his right shoulder, and a spot of blood seeped through the bandages over what must have been a bad puncture wound. Even so, he didn't look bothered. He stepped up to Cavo, strapped and packing. Covered in old-style ink tattoos that ran up his neck and framed his face in sharp black curves. It doesn't matter where she is, he said. You Satjoy. Stupid thing to ask, thought Cavo. Nothing like, replied the Scarver. Name is Grish, and you'll keep Satjoy's name out of your mouth. Get back to work. Cavo nodded. He had no intention of querying the net for any of the aliases. If the Dodge had outbound sniffers, he didn't want the Scarvers learning he was running intel on them. He was already tracing the roots of the core components, getting his bearings on the architecture. Highly sophisticated, but a dozen years old. Working out the setup took longer than usual, but the gang wasn't so impatient as Jobs. Chromejaw left the room almost immediately, but Goggles grabbed a drink and kicked back on the center couch. Cavo got the feeling it made no difference to them whether he was fixing an AI or writing brain simulations in binary. The internals of tech were a mystery to them, and a patch job would take as long as it was going to take. In this case, well over an hour before he had even prepped the main circuit. He flipped on the flat screen above the chassis. The rig's control panel lit up with letters OC2, Operation Command and Control. Cavo clicked on a menu and pulled up a schematic of the machine's neurals. What he saw made no fucking sense. To a no-tech, one neural flowchart looked the same as any other. Colored strings of data swayed between the various processing sectors like a display running an ambient animation. Its collection of data summaries and status feeds were pure tech Kabbalah. But just as a mortician could tell you the height and sex of a victim by a fragment of a jawbone and a pair of molars, a decent tech could glance at a neural schematic and get a good idea of the way a machine was thinking. Not what it was thinking, but the balance of interactions among its subsystems. The systems of this particular box flopped about in senseless patterns. Normal neurals formed a purposeful staccato, irregular but restrained, like improvised jazz. The thoughts of this box crashed randomly through its circuits, hitting first one subsystem, then another. Flows of data peaked suddenly, splashed through the neural webs, then disintegrated to nothing like foam in the rapids of a river. If forced to give it a human term, Cavo might have called it babbling. Has anyone tried linking to it recently? It suddenly hit him that none of the Scarvers he had seen were packing brain embeds. Satjoy tried talking to it yesterday. Said it gave him a headache. I believe that, said Cavo. Did he say what was wrong with it? Yeah, rumbled Grish. He said it was broke. He's not wrong. Cavo shook his head and started plugging in his linking circuit. After his recent mix-up with Lisa, he wasn't psyched to be neuro-linking. A second burn in one night was begging for perma-damage. All the same, he was more worried about the killers at his back than a think box frying out his brain. The risk of meltout was an occupational hazard that had lost its bite, while eating a bullet in a Dodge basement was a novel possibility. Then there was that little itch in the back of his brain, the one that wanted to see what the pandemonium on the neural screen was thinking, whether it had any thoughts at all. For the second time that night, he went in for a dive. Physical links usually took seconds to connect, the time required for the neurals to build an interpretation of the data stream, but this one spun its fans. Between his brain, the stent, and the AI, something was dropping the translation. The box on the other end wasn't even shaking hands, wasn't trying to meet him halfway. It might as well have been speaking ancient Sumerian and leaving the work up to him. Cavo wondered if it was due to the box's age or if it spoke some unregistered government dialect. As more seconds ticked by, however, he started to suspect his stent wouldn't make sense of the signals because they didn't make any sense to begin with. He felt his implants start to warm on the side of his face. Automatic safeguards prevented overheating, but they put a cap on processing power. So which was it? Literally melt down his neurons or tell the Scarvers he couldn't talk to their box? He mentally tapped off the safety and put his stent into overclock. Soon his implant shell was hot to the touch, burning his skin where it met the metal interface. The stent decided on an interpretation of the data stream it liked, and the portal appeared in Cavo's head. But unlike a normal neural link, waiting for Cavo to push the trigger, This one wanted to pull him in. Forget the dimmer switch. Reality was an after-image fading on a vid screen. In place of a single organized mind, Cavo was bowled over by a swarm of disconnected ideas, buzzing like 1,000 delirious cicadas. This was nothing like a cybernetic attack. There was no overloading of neurals, no calculated firing of synapses. Its effect was hypnotic. His own thoughts became lost in the mindless susurrations of the swarm, buffeted in every direction until it took a deliberate effort to prevent them being swept clean away. It was like trying to break away from the course of a dream, as it dragged you along by every twist and turn of its rambling narrative. In one instant, he would pry away from some strange loop of data, only to realize in the next that he had lost his train of thought, and slip back into the central course of another flow. Whenever his mind broke the surface of the current, he fought to push a single idea free of the swarm, disconnect. An idea he struggled to hold steady for the mere seconds it would take to break this dense connection. The danger was not in the sweep of the swarm itself, its incessant babblings. It was that he might forget that he was trying to leave in the first place, forget even the mental command that would cut him loose. He had one slim advantage, though. He only needed to trigger it once. Cavo burst the connection with enough force to shock him to his feet. In reality, he lay supine. Goggles and Grish stood over him, talking in distant voices he couldn't yet hear. Whatever happened in the box was already fading from his memory, like a long night of fever dreams. Sounds from the real world filtered in as the memories filtered out. He sat up and cracked his neck. "Guess the box knocked me out," he said. "Don't know how I did that." "Knocked you out?" said Goggles. "Kid, we had you chalked for slack." "That bad? How long?" His Stent's internal clock seemed busted. The reading didn't make any sense. "What time is it?" "Witching hour," said Grish. "You're one lucky motherfucker." 2 hours. He would have guessed 5 minutes at most. It was like he had dropped a dose of slipstream. There was a good chance Goggles and Grish had been debating whether to dump him in a drainage ditch. He held his head to stop the room from spinning and slowly climbed to his feet. "Is this what happened to Rika?" Grish shrugged. "Can't tell ya. She wasn't on the box when she went zombie. Box might not be the only thing infected. Did this happen to anyone else?" Grish huffed from his wide nostrils and his eyes narrowed, probably wondering how much information was safe for Cavo to know and how much made him a liability. It was clear their crew was in bad shape, and Cavo suspected more than a few of them had been slagged with the OC2. Might have been a few others. Who cares? Your job is the box. Can you fix it or not? Not sure. Cavo held his head as if thinking things over. The simple answer was abso-fucking-lutely not. At least he wasn't about to try until he knew what he was dealing with. First Lisa, then the brute. Supposing they were right, then whatever had infected the rig, it wasn't just eating machines, it was eating human brains. Viruses had been designed to attack across a substrate before, but the programs themselves never crossed the barrier. Organics and machines had too little in common for programs to make the transition between them. Besides, even if a virus managed to jump the boundary, it would still show up in the AI's code, but the OC2's neural model was still intact. Integrity scans showed no evidence of viral tampering. It was the machine's thoughts that were compromised, not its code. Cavo needed to choose his words carefully. He didn't give a shit about the Scarver's Militech box anymore. He needed to find out what had happened to Rika. Find out if there really was some monster bug out there, and if there was, he needed to slip the Scarvers and start running prophylactic on his own brain. But these trogs might not let him walk. Puzzle pieces started snapping into place in his head. The gang's capo was 404, and they had been trading lead recently, maybe even tonight. There was a whole hornet's nest there for him to kick at. Your box got worked over pretty bad. Do you know anyone who might want to spike your system? You saying somebody did this? Asked Grish. No organization able to pull off something this big would bother with trogs like the Scarvers, but Cavo was certain they didn't know that. He suspected all their tech specialities were as swarmed as Rika. I'm not saying anything, said Cavo. Depends if you believe in accidents. I've never seen a rig this bad that wasn't targeted. I need to see Rika. What good's that gonna do? Asked Grish. Don't know, said Cavo. Maybe nothing. I don't know if I can fix your box. I don't even know if your rig can be fixed. But some part of Rika's brain might know what happened, might even know who did this. Grish wrenched his jaw and got up real close to Cavo's face. Trogs from the street were often better at spotting lies than civs with a lot more brains. They seemed to have a nose for it. Cavo had one advantage. The Scarvers still needed him, at least for the moment. Fine. Cyber, Toro, take our boy here to Rika. Cavo reached for his pack, but Grish yanked his arm back. "Leave your shit here, or are you planning to fix her too?" "No," said Cavo. "Don't think I can." The Scarvers had stashed Rika away with a medic named Brax, who ran a small off-grid clinic in the gang's district. It was the kind of business opened by ex-docs who had gone under for selling hospital inventory, killing someone rich, or fucking too many patients. The ride over gave Cavo a chance to check up on recent events. News reports confirmed several shootings in the boroughs overlapping the territories of the Scarvers and the Jukes boys. 5 confirmed bodies, and that's only counting the ones left on the concrete. If there really was a silicon to human cross-infection, Cavo needed to get himself cleared as soon as possible. A turf war gave him the best chance he had of slipping his escort. Brax operated his business from a suite in the concrete residential, leased right on the ground floor to let the wounded in and the bodies out. The shabby waiting room smelled of rubbing alcohol and disinfectant, white ceramic floors stained brown at the grooves along the tiles. Patients huddled on stainless steel benches, faces as worn and yellow as the walls. A goon nursing a wad of bloodied rags in his fist, bumps knees with a woman rocking her head between her elbows, trying to hold in a bad slip. The frizzy-head trop handling intake behind a blast-proof transaction window could have doubled as a patient. Cracked nails and hand spasms were a dead giveaway for a long-term junkie. Toro tapped the plexiglass window with his sidearm, angling his neck to flash the Scarver's tattoo at its base. No waiting room for them. The wide receptionist buzzed open the door to let them into the back rooms. Cavo snapped a shot of the pair of Scarvers as they went in and prepared it for upload. Timing would be critical if he wanted to crawl out of this alive. Brax knew what the Scarvers wanted the moment he saw them. He left a patient with an ear sewn half on, and led the group to a room at the end of the hall, to a room so cramped Toro was forced to wait in the hall. Rika lay bricked on an old model hospital bed with busted sidebars. "Are you a med too?" asked Brax. "I already told your boys there's nothing I can do for her." "Nothing like," said Cavo. "Not my boys either. I'm only doing a job. I need to know what happened to her." Brax shrugged. "I don't know much. She'd been going gonzo for over a week when she first came in. She said she was having trouble focusing, going into dazes, stuff like that. I checked her out, but there was nothing wrong with her. Then she came back. What is it, the 12th? So many 3 days ago. Came back paranoid as a rat. I don't know. It was all schizo talk. Stuff in her head playing over and over. Obsessive thoughts, I guess. The Scarvers don't want guesses. What were the thoughts?" "Shit, right. I'm not trying to hide anything. I see a lot of scugs in a week. She asked me if I ever got a song stuck in my head. Sure, we all do. The girl wasn't even listening to me. Whatever was in her head, she said it was getting louder. Harder to ignore. Like I said, she wasn't making any sense. I gave her some Sapporo and sent her packing. That's all. You didn't try to do anything for her. Do I look like a shrink to you? Her vitals were normal, brain scan normal, blood work normal. I could fire my Fabian into the crowd outside and hit 20 people more fucked up than she was. Anyway, your friends came back last night and dropped her on me, dazed out of her head. I did another scan and got what you see now." Brax set the power on a wall monitor and lit up a real-time schematic of Rika's neurals. As a biological system, there were telling differences from Scarver's OC2 rig, but the similarities were unmistakable. That settled it for Cavo. He might be on a fuse already. It was time to break out of the snare. He queued into the net and downloaded a map of the local neighborhood, while running a whisper search for affiliates of the Jukes boys. Then he packed up the video feed of Goggles and Toro in the lobby, taped on a geolocation packet, and spat it out on every Jukes social he could find. In a street roll running hot, a pair of lone soldiers was a target too prime to pass up. The misery of it was the tip had to be anonymous. There was no way to beg for safe passage without branding himself as a rat. Whatever bullets were headed for Toro and Goggles would be coming for him as well. The tip alone was close to suicide. If he and Scarver survived the next 48 hours, Cavo would need to burn his ID and pick up a fresh call sign. But right now those concerns were far in the future. For the moment, all he needed to do was keep the Scarvers on point. The Jukes would need time too. Cavo blinked his eyes and then squinted in a bright light. Brax was at his side, scanning his pupils with a flash pen. "You good there, boyo? You froze up there for a minute." "Prime," said Cavo. He turned away from Rika's brain scan and waved away the pen. "Don't worry about it. Do you think this was a cybernetic attack?" "You know your boys asked that before. It's not like anything I've ever seen. There are 2 types of cybernetic attacks. The first are neurotrojans. It tries to trigger your brain to do something it wasn't meant to do. Seizures, abnormal heart rate, or plain fade out. The second tries to overload your inputs, push the organic neurons past their limits to fry out pieces of your brain. So maybe you can't talk anymore, can't see colors, lose half your memory, or simply go brain dead. They could put you in a coma if they burned out your attention center, but that's not what Rika has. Everything's intact. All the neurons are firing fine. They're just not doing anything useful. How much longer do you think your friends need me to hold on to the girl? I'm not running a motel here. Not long, I think, said Cavo. He walked back to Toro and keyed up the street cams, but there were no signs of the Dukes. Timing was everything now. If they came too late, Toro would cart him back to the Scarvers with an impossible task. Too early and the Dukes would be in position to light them up the moment they stepped out the building. Police monitors showed traffic violations popping off in the Dukes district, but he had to click off the net to keep from falling over. Toro and Goggles herding him back to the street like prison guards, the hairs on the back of his neck sharp as needles every step of the way. Like everyone else in the city, he'd been caught in crossfire before, but this was the first time he'd be down its sights. He kept his face slack, eyes on the walk in front of him, resisting the urge to scan the streets or make a move for his sidearm. Actions that might tip off his escort or leave a record on the city cams, and prove to whoever saw them that Cavo had known the hit was coming. Prepared as he was, Cavo was amazed at how quickly everything went to hell. A violent Pinto sped onto the street from the south, animated Dukes tags and signature bulldog cascading down its side like a title fight marquee. On its LED windows, an anime trop with tits half out threw her arms around a muscle-bound Dukes in dark shades. The cartoon gangster was lifting an AK and wasting crowds of twig-armed scugs with useless little pistols. Cavo had barely a second to take it all in. Then the passenger window with its cartoon violence rolled back into the Pinto's frame, replaced by real gun barrels taking aim at the actual Scarvers. Time smashed down on the brakes. White flames flash over the muzzles of automatic weapons, rattling at 150 decibels. Goggles' torso jerks sideways from double impacts on his chest and shoulder. Cavo's vision starts to spin, pinprick stars floating over his visual field, and he drops to one knee. The street erupts into screams. Cavo isn't sure when Goggles pulled his sidearm. By the time the Pinto has popped 6 rounds, the bleeding Scarver had drawn the weapon and is loosing fire like a madman. He snaps a boomstick from his harness and tosses it into the Pinto, lighting the interior with a loud bang. Toro had taken cover behind the Scarver's red sedan. He fires across its hood, but its focus isn't on the fight with the Pinto. His eye is scanning north, prime instincts. A black SUV peels in from the opposite direction, and the smoking Pinto burns its tires and skids to a stop in the center of the road. Duke's boys fire out the windows as the SUV tries to back out of the jam. Head reeling, Cavo drew his Vintex and hustled up the sidewalk, parallel to the line of parked cars. His cover ended at a blue coupe 15 yards short of the next corner. Rounds burst through the coupe's metal frame. A woman cowering in a pencil skirt took a hit to her side and slumped to the ground. A Fimo addict lay next to her, blood gurgling out, a death rattle in his throat, and Cavo crouched against a wheel and returned fire. He glanced at the corner and prepared to make a break for it. Suddenly, he felt his shoulder was gripped by a vice. He turned to see Goggles' torso slick with blood, the Scarver's face twisted in a rabid grimace. "Get the fuck back to the car!" Sweat streamed down the Scarver's forehead. His skin flushed red, nostrils flaring like he had just shot a dose of something sinister. Must have spiked a hit of Krieg. Cavo started to raise his Vintex when 2 Duke's boys on foot rounded the corner of the block and began to fire. Bullet flew straight into Goggles' skull above his left temple. His brain, amped up with aura, never got the message. The frothing Scarver charged at the shooter, gripped his face with a metal palm, and began bashing his head repeatedly into the concrete. Without thinking, Cavo unloaded 3 rounds into the second trog and ran past Goggles as the Scarver ripped an arm off the screaming Dukes. Dashing around the corner, Cavo called up a visual of the local map and ran a Pathfinder on his Stent's onboard CPU. Heading for his unit with a tail was out of the question. Duke's territory was due west, and he wasn't going back to the Scarvers. Program traced 3 potential routes, and he jogged toward a tight series of alleys indicated on the display 2 blocks to the east. Motorcycles growled in the distance, Duke's boys circling the perimeter, and Cavo needed to clear the sector before somebody gave him his mugshot. Bullets whizzed past his head as he sprinted over the cross street. The scugs from the SUV were still on his tail. He raced into the alley, his focus on the street map overlaid on his visual field. Cavo had to stay offline or risk getting brainswarmed, and with live tracking disabled, it took all his concentration to keep his bearings in the maze of alleyways. The lanes served as supply and utility access for the surrounding buildings. Running past a row of power transformers, Cavo began to hear the clap of footsteps not far behind. The Jukes had followed him in. He looked back at the last turn and fired 2 shots at the corner to check their speed. His Vintex was a crack model, double action with 17 rounds, but when he looked at the counter on top, he was surprised to read only 7 rounds remaining. Real horror hit him when the path he was taking ended in a brick wall. Had he lost track of the turns, or was the map he had downloaded to his stent out of date? He doubled back to the previous junction. Jukes were coming around the bend, and he fired until they backed away. The next turn he tried ended in a chain-link fence, 20 feet tall. He could climb it, but not before the Skugs caught up and tore him to pieces. Too late to try another route now. With 3 shots left, he crouched on the ground and took aim at the corner. Someone popped a smoke stick and the alley filled with a thick grey mist. Now there was no way to see what he was firing at. Muzzles flashed and he heard the rattle of automatic gunfire, followed by screams. But the bullets hadn't flown in his direction. Someone had engaged the Jukes from the other side. Another smoke stick popped, followed by another exchange of fire, then several short small bursts that tapered into silence. Out of the dense smoke, a shining green eye flickered to life, followed by the sound of footsteps. A dark shape slowly emerged from the haze. The face a mash of flesh, wires and electronic circuits, the figure wore a short brown poncho over its machine-enhanced torso. A long cyberlinked rifle held casually in its arms. Hybrid 8 was an enigmatic organization that exercised most of its control through affiliated intermediaries. Their full members were few in number and rarely seen by civilians. The cybernetic chimera stood and regarded Cavo with an unreadable expression, its organic face buried too far beneath artificial augmentations to display anything resembling human emotion. Cavo stared back into the robotic features and rose carefully to his feet, hands spread wide. The cyborg's grip remained loose on its rifle, and Cavo holstered his Vintex. With a sidelong glance, he watched its glowing green eye as he stepped slowly forward, brushed past the stony figure, and walked out of the alley. Back at his apartment, Cavo sat on the edge of his bed studying a live neuroscan of his own brain. It wasn't quite the same as reading the neurals from a think box, but a decade of epileptic monitoring meant he had seen more brain feeds than most doctors. Neurons staring at themselves. Something was definitely off about the patterns. It wasn't something easy to pinpoint or put into words, but the aberrations were already there. Life first evolved from the mindless interactions of molecules, replicating structures barely distinguishable from non-living matter. And now the mindless interactions between nodes of the network had developed parallel organisms, self-reinforcing and self-replicating signals which grew in complexity until they reached a critical mass. Singing songs that stuck in your head like gum on your boots. Songs you couldn't scrape off because they had evolved to stick to brains just like yours. Brainworms were an old idea. Corporations and intelligence agencies had tinkered with them to little practical effect. Memes and ad campaigns got in your head but rarely controlled behavior. Now the mindless buzz of network feeds had engineered the ultimate specimens. Cavo mentally triggered his communication circuits and his head went dizzy. Audio band only. He didn't want to touch the networks any more than he had to. "Casey, you up?" Her channel clicked open and a weak voice stirred on the line. "Huh? Cavo?" she growled sleepily. "I am now, you dick. What time is it?" "Late. Sorry, Case, but I came down with something bad. I need your help. Like, now." Cav," she smirked. "I knew you'd come around. What do you want me to wear?" Cavo groaned. "I'm serious, Case. I'll make it up to you. Shares, hardware, whatever you need." Casey specialized in outpatient care for neuroprosthetics, fully licensed on-grid with a little side hustle to smooth out the rent. She'd been Cavo's medical contact for the last 5 years. "Really, Cavo? Shares, don't be a fucking ass." "Please, Case. I've got a burn timer in my brain and I don't know when it pops." "I ought to let it cook you. What do I got to bring?" "Medkit, neuroscanner, and a backup shock box. Oh, and my solite drips you got. This could be a long one." Changed my mind. I think I'll take your shares after all." "Sure thing. And Case, stay off the wires. Their networks, VR streams, all of it." Cavo clicked off the channel to sideline any explanations. It would only slow things down, and besides, the more questions he answered, the more she'd write him off as cranked. Besides, he had too much to get done before she got there. He pulled a blank think box from his tech rack and got to work. Casey arrived within the hour, her disheveled hair tied back in a 3-second ponytail. He bussed her in and she met him with sleep-deprived eyes and a resentful glare. She really had been quick about it, and Cavo was grateful. She looked like she'd rolled out of bed and thrown on some sleepwear. White tank top and black cotton sweatpants with a pink K-line brand stripe. Casey dropped her duffel bag on Cavo's desk and tossed her personal bag on the bed. He had already prepared most of the connections and she pulled up a chair and began to unpack. Cavo sat down and pointed to the monitor. This is a scan of my neurals. You see these subwaves? They're small, but they aren't normal. Casey leaned over his chair and peered into the screen. You know, I think you're right. I wouldn't have blinked him if you hadn't mentioned it. I didn't scan it either at first. Had to have it pointed out. Casey squinted at the lines. Okay, so you got a little brain shiver. Is this what you woke me up for? Your epilepsy is 10 times worse. I'm not finished, said Cavo. These feedback loops are going to keep growing. Don't ask me how. I don't understand the whys or whats, but pretty soon they'll get like this. He clicked on the recorded stream of Rika's neurals and set them side by side. This was a tech named Rika. She's a zombie now. Complete meltout. Casey shoved Cavo's chair to the side, propped her elbows against the desk. As she read the data, her face slowly scrunched into a wince. Shit, Cavo. What do you bite? He shrugged and nudged his chair back to the monitor. I don't think it will happen all at once. Different brain regions, sub-networks will pick up the pattern before spreading. Rika was up for days before she went out. I fired up a think box while you were getting ready. Same pattern. I think humans should be about the same. Think box? An AI? You're a fucking human being. Some of the time anyway. And you're basing this off what happened to a machine. Cavo sat down at the station and plugged his stent into the computer while Casey taped his forehead and left arm with vital monitors. No time for any more testing, said Cavo. I need you to watch my neurals. Whenever you notice a part of my brain, I don't care how small, falling into a pattern like Rika's, I need you to zap it with the stent. Do a local reset and send a counter signal back into the net. Casey frowned as she unpacked her shock kit. I can do that, Cav, but I don't see the point. What do you do when a song gets stuck in your head? Maybe try to push it out with a new one. I'm trying to teach this thing to play nice. And what if it doesn't? How long do I keep zapping you for? Until the foreign waves come down to whatever you think is a good level. Not all the way though, not to 0. Then we'd just be back where we started. Keep hitting it until the interference stops trying to grow, or until my brain fries. Oh, shut up already. Casey grabbed Cavo's head and yanked it to the side, plugging in the leads of the shock controllers. You sound like a drama tune. She took his left arm and strapped it to his chair's armrest to prevent him from thrashing. I'm just saying, it could happen. Yeah? And what do I do if you get caught? Vault's open behind the tech rack. I'm holding a few drinks for Vogel and left something for Vass. Other than that, take what you need. It'll look like standard neurolepture. Authorities won't ask you any questions. You really are a fucking ass. Casey hit his brain with a mild shock that sparked behind his eye socket. Cavo slapped his eye with his palm and bent over cursing. Oh, by the way, testing, said Casey. My bad. It's working, grumbled Cavo. We better get started. Your funeral, she sighed. I'm ready though. Cavo opened his stent to the network and switched over to the full network monitoring. This put his brain on passive and allowed real-time traffic to flow into his head like the bustling of a virtual city. Status feeds, advertisements, service requests, newsreels, money transfers, and synchronization mechanisms coalesced into strange patterns, filtering into his brain like a hypnotic droning. Consciously, he sensed nothing out of the ordinary. After a few seconds, however, Casey yelled. There! Cavo felt his brain hit by the shock of an anti-epileptic pulse. He clenched his teeth, more from surprise than actual pain. You saw it? Yeah. In the fusiform gyrus, it was really happening. Honestly, until now, I thought you were gonzo. I wasn't too sure. His face screwed up from another shock. Fuck, already? Yeah, a piece of the basal forebrain. That was fast. Didn't think that. Another zap. Cavo winced and wrenched his body against the back of his chair. Shit, this is so weird, said Casey. I've seen a brain go sour like this. Lots of them will, grunted Cavo. It's spreading. Casey's eyes flicked back and forth between her patient's vitals and his neural schematic. It seems to pass up motor functions and autonomic systems. Everything I'm seeing is in cognition centers or the preconscious. That tracks. Can't screw with the autonomic without killing the host. Even if we do change the pattern, do you really expect it to fix a net-wide infection? Cavo shook his head, squeezing out his words between the stent's electric shocks. Nothing like. Only fixing myself. I can't be the only one who's scanned this. ISEC must know by now, but I can't wait for them to step up. It didn't take 10 minutes before Casey wanted out of Cavo's plan, told herself to feed him a couple of sedatives, put him on a cognitive soother, and walk right out on his insanity. But every time she gave Cavo a particularly nasty jolt, he shook his head and told her to keep at it. And reading his schematics, it looked like it was already too late to walk away. If anything, the abnormal signals were growing stronger and more frequent in every area of his brain. It became a struggle to locate the right regions and zap away the bad neurals before the new ones sprang up. By the end of the first hour, he had left off talking entirely, only giving the sign to continue by an angry curl of his fingers, a sort of nausea built behind his eyes, like radio trying to tune his station through nuclear fallout. He didn't attempt to track the time that passed, told himself time didn't exist, nothing but the moment was real, and surviving the present was the sole point of his existence. He gripped his chair, pinned by the neural overload. Like all the epileptic fits he had ever had, coming one after the other as the hours passed, Caveau awoke to the darkness of his studio apartment. The features of his room slowly resolved from a mottled grey blur into definite shapes. Casey's night bag resting on her chair, the power supplies and blank boxes of his tech rack. Blue and green indicator lights glinted on the switches of his workstation and the sleeping monitors. A pale glow slanted in from the right, where Casey had half turned the long blinds of his apartment windows, casting shadowed tracks on the kitchen counter. Far beyond the glass, a vidboard flickered an advertisement for Cyrene skin drives, above pink neon signs announcing the night sales of liquor and dancing girls. Casey lay curled on his bed, a leg draped over his body pillow, with her hair scattered, out cold. He let her alone. The deep black of the sky proved a whole day had passed since he had started working. As Caveau looked at her, a stream of data washed through his brain, and he realized with a start that he was still connected to the net. He knew there shouldn't be any danger. Casey wouldn't have left him on the hook if it wasn't safe. But something about the networks had changed. The jumble of senseless data that had polluted the streams now slid into place like random noise resolving into sound. He went to the blinds, rolled them to one side, and stared down into the city below. Brimming in his head like a second sight, he heard the motions of a million humans milling on the streets like ants, saw the autovans and the street cams, and heard the voices of 1,000 think boxes chittering like a swarm. Vehicles with network capability, AR appliances, reactive billboards, and automatic shipping drones, all of them humming the pattern. He heard Rika through 20 solid city blocks, lying zombed in Brax's clinic. Miles behind her, the Scarver's OC2 rig shone in the air like a spotlight, not in the visual spectrum, something else entirely. A half-mile away, he saw an empty blot in space where Lisa crouched in the corner of Jobs' complex, refusing to touch the net. The night had dawned on a new breed of cybernetics. The city had begun to sing a new set of rules, and a tech able to hear the words could pick it apart like a mechanic on an engine. At that instant, Caveau caught the white eyes of the brute gleaming through the data from 3 miles away in a grimy basement bar. The brute raised his head, bared a row of sharp metal teeth, and grinned straight into his eyes.